This is a Fox News Alert. I'm Bret Baier in Washington. We have massive news on multiple fronts. On a day the U.S. Supreme Court dealt a major blow to unions, Justice Anthony Kennedy announced he is going to retire next month, opening a second vacancy for President Trump to fill. The White House does everything today but confirm a date for a meeting between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Also announces a new White House communications official. On Capitol Hill, a Republican compromise on immigration fails miserably on the House floor, and a senior member of the Democratic leadership is shocked by losing in a primary to a relative unknown Democratic socialist. But we begin with President Trump getting another opportunity to put his stamp on the U.S. Supreme Court for years and years to come, and to establish a judicial legacy that will live on long after his presidency. Justice Kennedy has been a swing vote on a number of major Supreme Court rulings. His announcement sets off a political power struggle that will feature massive efforts by conservatives to have their voices heard and by Democrats to try to force the president to go with a moderate or wait until after the midterm elections. All of this comes as the current roster of justices issued a decision today that shows just how much power this court wields. They ruled with a 5-4 vote that public sector unions cannot force workers to pay fees to support collective bargaining and other activities. Not only a big hit to unions across the country, but also a big financial hit for the Democratic Party. We have Fox team coverage of the Kennedy retirement. John Roberts at the White House looks at the politics and what President Trump may do next. We begin with my colleague and anchor of Fox News at Night, Shannon Bream, with details from the U.S. Supreme Court, where she's been all day. Good evening, Shannon.
Good evening, Brett. Well, it was a quiet end to the term, we thought, this morning. They gavelled out until they returned to the bench in October with no hint of a retirement. All of that changed this afternoon as we found out that the man who was appointed by a Republican president but often was left of center on social issues, Justice Anthony Kennedy, is retiring.
The fact he is retiring, this is a total game changer. It changes everything.
30 years on the bench and often the 5 in those 5-4 decisions. Justice Anthony Kennedy says he's stepping down from the Supreme Court effective July 31st.
This will change the dynamic of the court potentially for a generation.
Something conservatives are celebrating, and the left is sounding the alarm over today. That's because even though he was nominated by one of the most celebrated Republicans in history, President Ronald Reagan,
I, Anthony Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
Kennedy was mostly a reliable conservative, but one who leaned left when it came to the issues of abortion and LGBT rights. He authored the majority opinion striking down the Defense of Marriage Act, and also wrote the landmark decision legalizing same-sex marriage in all 50 states, saying, quote, "No union is more profound than marriage." Those decisions earned him praise from groups like the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, who are today warning about the president's list of 25 potential replacements, accusing them of having, quote, well-established records of bias against women, the LGBTQ community, people of color, immigrants, environmental protection, and access to health care. On the issue of health care, many wondered where Kennedy would land on the Affordable Care Act. Sources say he never wavered in his opinion that it was unconstitutional, casting his vote with the conservatives. Chief Justice Roberts turned out to be the deciding vote upholding Obamacare in that case. Former Kennedy clerk Andrew Bentz describes his former boss's legacy this way.
I think he'll be remembered as one of the most influential justices of the last 25, maybe the last 100 years. He's had a singular impact on the court and shaped jurisprudence in many different areas, from the First Amendment to gay rights and everything in between.
Announcing his plans in a simple letter to the president, Kennedy talked about what an honor it has been to, quote, defend the Constitution and the laws that must always conform to its mandates and promises. Promises, he says, unite all Americans.
We as a people are bound together. We as a people find our self-definition, our respect, our heritage, and our destiny in the Constitution.
Justice Kennedy joined the bench in 1988 after a 97-0 vote in the Senate. Brett, it is very hard in today's political environment to imagine that happening.
Amazing shift. Shannon, thank you. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says he expects a vote on Kennedy's successor in the fall. But between now and then, there is a political war to be waged that will be waged no matter who President Trump nominates. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts continues our coverage from the North Lawn. Good evening, John.
Good evening, Brett. No question, this is going to be a tough one. President Trump learned of Kennedy's retirement early this afternoon after Kennedy called and then came down to the White House to see him. But his retirement had been expected for some time.
Half hour ago.
Were you surprised?
He came to the White House. We had a wonderful discussion.
In the Oval Office with Portugal's president this afternoon, President Trump paid tribute to outgoing Justice Anthony Kennedy.
He's been a great justice of the Supreme Court. He is a man who is displaying great vision. He's displayed tremendous vision and tremendous heart, and he will be missed.
Conservative groups are confident that President Trump will pick a replacement that they are happy with. The president has promised he will choose a nominee from his published list of 25 conservative judges. Frontrunners are said to be federal appellate court judges Brett Kavanaugh from the D.C. Circuit, the Seventh Circuit's Amy Coney Barrett, Thomas Hardiman of the Third Circuit, and Raymond Ketledge and Amol Thapar, both from the Sixth Circuit.
In our country, the selection of a justice of the United States Supreme Court is considered, I think we can all say, one of the most important events, one of the most important things for our country.
President Trump has the opportunity to cement a rock-solid conservative majority at the court for a decade or more. With the stakes so high, the president will run into a buzzsaw of opposition in the Senate. Minority Leader Chuck Schumer already urging Congress to reject all of the president's choices.
Americans should make it clear that they will not tolerate a nominee chosen from President Trump's preordained list, selected by powerful special interests who will reverse the progress we have made over the decades.
Until the Kennedy announcement, the big news of the day had been a pending summit between President Trump and Russia's Vladimir Putin.
It's good for everybody. So we'll probably be meeting sometime around my trip to Europe.
The foundation for a bilateral meeting was laid today by National Security Advisor John Bolton. In Moscow, Bolton met with both Putin and his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. At a news conference, Bolton said he expects the topic of Russian meddling in the 2016 election to come up.
We did indeed talk about Russian interference in the elections, and I expect it will be a subject of conversation between the two presidents as well.
The leaders last met on the sidelines of the APEC summit in Vietnam. At that time, the White House said there was no need for a bilateral meeting, that the two didn't have much to talk about. How things have changed.
We'll be talking about Syria. I think we'll be talking about Ukraine. I think we'll be talking about many other subjects, and we'll see what happens. So you never know. You never know about meetings, what happens, right?
The White House and Kremlin will announce tomorrow the where and when of the meeting. The most likely target the week of July 9th, when President Trump is in Europe for a NATO summit and visit to the UK. Two possible locations, Helsinki, Finland, and Vienna, Austria, where President Kennedy met Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev at the height of the Cold War. And one other piece of news coming out of the White House today, Fox News has learned that former Fox News co-president Bill Shine will take on a senior communications role here for President Trump. While Shine's official title has yet to be decided, it will likely be at the Deputy Chief of Staff level. Brett?
John Roberts, live on the North Lawn. John, thanks. Let's get some analysis now from the outside advisor to President Trump for judicial nominations. Leonard Leo joins us tonight. Leonard, thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
First, put this in perspective about how big a deal this opening, not just a opening, this opening is.
Sure. Justice Kennedy's been on the courts for over 30 years, and he's played an enormously important role in helping to fashion so many different areas of our jurisprudence, from gun rights to freedom of speech, separation of powers, federalism. It's a big deal.
The process. I'm being kind of whispers that the Neil Gorsuch blueprint is basically what is going to move forward.
Yes. The president had enormous success in nominating Neil Gorsuch to the court, and I think that's the kind of process that you'll see going forward, another nominee like him.
Is the sense, you heard the Senate Majority Leader, that this is going to happen quickly? Is there a timeline on this?
Usually it takes the White House about 2 or 3 weeks to get a nomination out, and then normally it takes about 70 to 100 days for a Senate to confirm. So the leader's right. You're looking at the fall, and you could have somebody seated just before the beginning of the October term of the court or just after it starts.
What about the Democrats, including the Senate Minority Leader, who are out there saying this can't happen? It needs to wait till after the election.
president appoints justices to the court. It's one thing to say that, you know, just before a presidential election we should have a cooling off period, but we have a president. The American people knew who he was going to nominate because he gave them a list, so we should just move forward.
And he's saying that this list is unacceptable, but in reality, because of the vote structure in the Senate, there's really nothing Senate Democrats can do, is there, to stop a nomination from going forward, aside from tripping that person up in a hearing?
If the president nominates someone extraordinary, like Neil Gorsuch again, I think it's very hard to stop that kind of a nomination. The American people were widely supportive of Neil Gorsuch, and Justice Gorsuch had bipartisan support in the Senate.
Okay, let's talk about a couple of the names that we're hearing about already. John mentioned some of them. Judge Bret Kavanaugh, D.C. Circuit, U.S. Court of Appeals here in Washington.
Very distinguished service on the federal bench, hundreds of opinions published out of the D.C. Circuit. Someone who understands that those limits on government power in our Constitution are inextricably intertwined with the preservation of freedom in our country.
Will he have problems with Democrats?
Well, as Senator Schumer has said, anyone the president nominates will have problems with Democrats. But ultimately, I think red state Democrats and moderates in the Senate will understand that someone like Bret Kavanaugh or another Neil Gorsuch-type nominee would be quite suitable for our country.
He was a top official in the George W. Bush White House.
Yes.
Let's talk about Judge Thomas Hardiman, Third Circuit, U.S. Court of Appeals, chambers in Pittsburgh.
Judge Hardiman was someone who the president actually interviewed the first time around, and again, someone who's been on the bench quite a while, very extensive record, seen lots of cases, someone, again, who understands that it's the job of a judge to interpret the laws it's written.
Speaking of those laws, just recently, 5-4 rulings in which Kennedy was in the majority. You have union dues, just out today, Trump travel ban, abortion language specifics, Texas redistricting, state sales tax, Ohio voter roll purge, just to name a few recently. But he's been swing vote on a lot of major cases. Is the fear on the left justified that this means that Roe v. Wade is in jeopardy if one of the 25 gets through the process?
The left has been using the Roe v. Wade scare tactic since 1982, when Sandra O'Connor was nominated. And over 30 years later, nothing's happened to Roe v. Wade. And the fact of the matter is we know as much about a number of the justices, for example, John Roberts, as we knew about Justice Kennedy when he was nominated. So I think the abortion issue is really very much a scare tactic. This needs to be about the Constitution more broadly. As you pointed out, Kennedy has been very important in propelling jurisprudence in lots of different areas of the law, and that's what this process should examine.
Let's take a listen to Justice Kennedy about the Constitution.
It is appropriate to recognize an essential truth, and that is that the Constitution of the United States is the single fact, the single reality, the single idea, the single moral principle that sets the United States apart from other nations now and throughout history. I shall honor the Constitution.
Nominated in 1988 by President Reagan. Justice Kennedy made this decision, went and talked to President Trump. Do you know anything about those conversations?
I understand that it was a very cordial conversation. The president was very impressed with him, his graciousness, the 30 years plus of service he had on the court. You know, the Trumps and the Kennedys as families have known each other over the years on and off, so I think it was very gracious for the justice to go to the White House and talk directly to the president.
Talk about names?
I don't know if they did, but Justice Kennedy's a very prudent and discreet man, so I suspect that, you know, he understands the role that he plays and the role the president plays.
Do you think this will have an effect politically, and not where you are? You're looking at the justices and who's going to be nominated, the judges, but as you look at the political landscape, that this could have a big impact?
Any vacancy on the court does. The court these days makes so many important decisions that affect American life that it ought to be an important part of the political process. People ought to think seriously about who they want on the court, and I do suspect it'll have some impact in the Senate election process.
In 2016, all voters, conservatives and independents ranked it pretty high for the reason that they chose to vote. The way
as they should.
Leonard Leo, we'd love to have you back as this process gets moving.
It's good to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brett.
Up next, a major primary upset for a high-ranking congressional Democrat. We'll bring you that. On top of the double whammy from the U.S. Supreme Court today, Democrats are also licking their wounds over an unexpected primary loss. House Democratic Caucus Chairman Joe Crowley of New York was upset by a political neophyte and self-described socialist. Chief National Correspondent Ed Henry looks at what this says potentially about a divided Democratic Party.
An earthquake for Democrats as a powerful congressman potentially in line to replace Nancy Pelosi party leader Joe Crowley lost his primary to a newcomer. 28-year-old socialist Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a disciple of socialist Senator Bernie Sanders, who says she wants Medicare for all, so-called free tuition for college students, and wants to abolish ICE, which protects the nation's borders.
Gone is the party of JFK. Here is the party of radical socialism.
Pelosi was in a race of her own today to insist Crowley's turf in Queens, New York is so liberal, it does not mean bigger trouble nationally.
They made a choice in one district. So let's not get yourself carried away.
Except Pelosi said the opposite in 2014, when Republican Majority Leader Eric Cantor lost his primary.
The Republican Party going even further to the right.
The question for Pelosi now is whether the blue wave she's hyping for a November takeover of the House is starting to boomerang, as Republicans get fired up by the tilt to the left, which includes Democrat Maxine Waters calling for more protests and verbal attacks targeting aides to President Trump.
There was a time in America's history where you could be denied service in a restaurant based on the color of your skin. Now, apparently, it's the color of your voter registration card.
So, Mr. Chairman, if you want to talk about civility, you start with the President of the United States.
In New York, Ocasio-Cortez had a much more uplifting message about a working mom with limited money. And a young Latina taking out a party boss thrilled Bernie Sanders.
We're seeing a whole lot of young people getting involved in Our Revolution organization, getting involved in grassroots campaign.
That energy is a good sign for Democrats in safe liberal seats, but it could get more complicated in moderate House districts and red Senate seats, as the GOP base, already amped up by the retirement of Justice Anthony Kennedy, will get frequent reminders about socialists rising.
It was a stunning development. The energy in the Democratic Party is self-avowed socialists, open borders.
Another boost for the GOP base may come from the fact that Crowley's ouster makes it more likely that Pelosi will stay on as either Speaker or Minority Leader, so she'll remain front and center in Republican attack ads this fall. Brett?
Ed, thank you. Fox News has confirmed White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders has a Secret Service security detail now on a temporary basis. This comes following the much-covered incident at the Virginia restaurant in which Sanders was asked to leave. Stocks were down today. The Dow lost 166. The S&P 500 was off 23. The Nasdaq plunged 117 today. An East Pittsburgh police officer who shot an unarmed black teenager is facing a criminal homicide charge tonight. Officer Michael Rosfeld is accused of killing 17-year-old Antoine Rose Jr. as he fled a traffic stop. The district attorney says Rose showed his hands and clearly did not have a weapon. The FBI agent who told a colleague he would stop Donald Trump from being elected gave a deposition today at the House Judiciary Committee. The meeting with Peter Strzok was closed to the public and the media. Republicans said they're unconvinced that Strzok's anti-Trump texts and political bias did not infect the Clinton email and Russia investigations. Democrats emphasized the texts were intimate conversations and that Strzok was not the sole decision-maker working with a team of nearly 24. FBI Director Christopher Wray and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein testify publicly tomorrow before the House Judiciary Committee. It's back to the drawing board tonight for House Republican leaders. They failed, and failed big today, to get a compromise immigration reform bill past their own rank and file. The measure went down 301 to 121, with 112 Republicans voting against the bill, so it's back to the drawing board. While the southern border is ground zero in the immigration debate, many of the people trying to get into the U.S. there started out in Central America. American taxpayers spend billions of dollars to try to make that region worth staying in. National correspondent William Lajeunesse tells us why that effort is apparently failing.
When countries abuse us by sending their people up, not their best, we're not going to give any more aid to those countries. Why the hell should we?
After decades of foreign aid to Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, critics wonder what that money bought.
We are working on an infrastructure in the Northern Triangle. Let's continue with that policy.
Advocates say U.S. aid to Central American countries promotes economic progress and reduces violence, thereby cutting illegal immigration. But is that accurate?
In Honduras, we just can't live there anymore because of the gangs.
Apprehensions from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador peaked in 2015. After a slight decline, agents say arrests and asylum claims in 2018 are up again, despite more U.S. aid.
I really think that just giving money to those governments to try and solve their problems, I don't think that would be productive.
In the last decade, U.S. taxpayers sent billions to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Yet all three remain among the poorest in Latin America, while bribery, corruption, and murder rates rank among the world's worst.
These families are seeking asylum, protection from unimaginable prosecution and persecution and violence.
Conditions down there are quite horrible, that the violence is quite bad, but at the same time, it is not the responsibility of the United States to solve the problems of other countries.
U.S. aid is supposed to get young people out of gangs and into the workforce. Instead, they're leaving in droves, creating a crisis on the border.
Now think of all that aid that we give some of these countries.
While the president wants to cut aid next year, some in Congress want to double it. Others argue without more accountability, more money from Washington is throwing good money after bad.
Until there is a serious focus by the administration, a serious focus by Congress to really delve into this, we're not going to see the crisis at our border stop.
So the missing link in all of this, of course, is Mexico, which on Sunday will elect a new president. According to polls, it will be Andrés Manuel López Obrador. He's a populist who's expected to fill the largest stadium in Latin America tonight, Brett. And Vice President Pence will be in Guatemala tomorrow, where he'll tell Central American leaders do more to stop illegal immigration or face a loss in money. Back to you.
William Lajeunesse, live in Mexico City. William, thank you. Federal hate crime charges have been filed against a man accused of plowing a car into a crowd of people protesting a white nationalist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. One woman was killed, dozens others were injured last August. 21-year-old James Alex Fields is charged with 30 crimes, including one count of a hate crime resulting in the death of 32-year-old Heather Heyer. Fields already faces state charges of first-degree murder and other crimes. A Libyan man has been sentenced to 22 years in prison for his role in the deadly attacks on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, Libya in 2012. 47-year-old Ahmed Abu Hatala was convicted last November on multiple terrorism-related charges. He was acquitted of murder. Prosecutors accused Abu Hatala of heading an extremist militia and directing the attacks that killed Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other Americans. Defense attorneys argued the evidence was inconclusive and that Abu Hatala was being singled out because of his ultra-conservative Muslim beliefs. Up next, we'll go live to Florida, site of tomorrow's GOP gubernatorial debate here on Fox to look at both sides of that governor's race. In America's election headquarters tonight, the Trump effect in Florida. The Sunshine State holds its primary election in late August. President Trump is throwing his support in the Republican governor's race behind Congressman Ron DeSantis. But DeSantis is way behind in the polls so far. Correspondent Peter Ducey takes a look tonight from Kissimmee.
The president's primary picks finished first last night in New York and South Carolina. Now he's got his finger on the scale for another Republican, this time in Florida's gubernatorial primary, Congressman Ron DeSantis.
He's the 800-pound gorilla.
DeSantis hopes for a rally like the one that helped South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster win a Republican runoff last night.
You're talking about whatever venue you pick, you're filling it, and there are thousands of people waiting outside. When you see something like a McMaster rally where they have all the McMaster signs there, everybody's watching it. It's a huge, huge deal.
The president's record-picking primary candidates is better this year than last year, when Air Force One landed in Alabama for a last-minute boost to Senator Luther Strange.
You got thousands of people outside, thousands. And they may be listening because we put some big speakers out there. And I hope they're going to vote for Luther.
Strange lost the primary to Roy Moore, who later lost to Democrat Doug Jones. Today, a Republican strategist close to the Trump administration tells Fox News that in Florida, quote, the one lifeline DeSantis has is the endorsement from President Trump. Without that, I'd be convinced he'd be getting blown out in a month's time. That's because DeSantis trails by double digits in a Fox News poll of likely Republican primary voters to Agriculture Commissioner Adam Putnam, a Trump supporter himself.
I do believe that poll is a reflection of the same grassroots energy that propelled President Trump into the White House. We are in great shape.
Without the president's blessing, Putnam is banking on the backing of local officials to help win primary voters.
They're gravitating towards me and my vision for the future of Florida, putting vocational and technical training back into our schools, a law and order message that has resulted in 45 of Florida's sheriffs endorsing me, including 2 in the congressman's own district.
Putnam, the frontrunner, has been airing campaign ads in Florida for more than 2 months now. But DeSantis just started airing ads yesterday, and his campaign tells me they hope that once voters actually start to see more of those ads, then the gap between the two will narrow. Brett?
Peter Ducey, we'll see you down there tomorrow. Peter, thanks. On the Democrat side, the gubernatorial candidates are trying to break an embarrassing run of defeats for the party. Correspondent Phil Keating on Biscayne Bay shows us who's in the running.
Welcome our 4 candidates to the stage.
4 of the 5 Democratic candidates heading into the August primary held their governor's debate 2 weeks ago, arguing that this is their year to finally take Tallahassee back.
And I'm running for governor to level the playing field, to make sure everybody has the opportunity to live the American dream.
Former Miami Beach Mayor Philip Levine said he'd be willing to spend $25 million of his fortune on his candidacy. He's pledging to ban assault rifles, raise the minimum wage, boost public education spending, and aggressively deal with sea rise and climate change.
Too many Floridians are struggling.
Former Congresswoman Gwen Graham, daughter of former governor and U.S. Senator Bob Graham, wants to de-emphasize standardized testing in public schools, increase environmental standards, and makes opposition to the president a campaign centerpiece.
The soul of our country is under attack by Donald Trump.
We shouldn't have to turn decisions for the direction and the future direction of this state over to the Millionaires Only Club.
Tallahassee Mayor Andrew Gillum wants to hike the corporate tax rate, spend that revenue on education, and enact a Bernie Sanders-esque Medicare for All policy.
I am running to transform Tallahassee.
And progressive entrepreneur Chris King, who's never held public office, he calls for ending the death penalty, a sales tax on bullets, and legalizing marijuana.
Only candidate in America who is willing to stand up to Trump in his own dining room.
Palm Beach billionaire real estate tycoon Jeff Green didn't enter the campaign in time to make the debate, but he's in the race now, vowing to spend whatever it takes, and already flooding the airwaves with anti-Trump TV ads. Even though no Democrat's been elected Florida governor in 24 years, recent contests have been razor tight. For example, 4 and 8 years ago, Rick Scott narrowly won by 1 percentage point each time. Florida's the biggest swing state for a reason, Brett.
That's right, Phil. Thank you. Tomorrow night, we'll have a debate between the top 2 Republican candidates for Florida governor. We'll be live from...
We have, obviously, numerous people. We have a list of 25 people that I actually had during my election. We have a very excellent list of great talented, highly educated, highly intelligent, hopefully tremendous people. It will be somebody from that list.
If the president nominates someone extraordinary like Neil Gorsuch again, I think it's very hard to stop that kind of a nomination. The American people were widely supportive of Neil Gorsuch, and Justice Gorsuch had bipartisan support in the Senate.
A big day with the announcement that Justice Anthony Kennedy, a swing vote in so many different cases, the U.S. Supreme Court, is retiring. Next month, he sent a letter to President Trump and then met with the president, saying this letter is a respectful and formal notification of my decision effective July 31st of this year to end my regular active status as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. For a member of the legal profession, it is the highest of honors to serve on this court. Please permit me by this letter to express my profound gratitude for having had the privilege to seek in each case how to best know, interpret, and defend the Constitution and the laws that must always conform to its mandates and promises. With that, let's bring in our panel. Charles Hurt, opinion editor for The Washington Times. A.B. Stoddard, associate editor at Real Clear Politics. And Jonathan Swan, national political reporter for Axios. A.B., I know this caught people up on the Hill by surprise. It caught a lot of people by surprise. It had been in the whispers in the wind, possibilities. But when it happened, there were a lot of people shocked up there.
Yes, good and bad shock. Republicans were exuberant. It was really hard to for the Senate Majority Leader to sort of stifle his smile when he was talking about it.
Senator McConnell, like in party face mode.
It was hilarious. And then for Democrats, this is a very, very tough day. One senator today, a Democrat, told me that the retirement of Kennedy, sort of putting it off and hoping to delay it, was one of the last prayers at night when the head hit the pillow. I mean, this is very, very, very profound for them about not just what the vote is going to do and how it will just turn out in the midterms, excite Republicans and conservatives, but really what it means about the impact of these decisions going forward.
Let alone the decision today about unions that really hits unions pretty hard, and also a big fundraiser for Democrats.
So President Trump has, I sort of think about it as two phases of the way he's thought about the court. The first phase is he has thought subsequently, and I think is correct, that it was a masterstroke, a political masterstroke of his to release that list, because it was really important to Republican-based voters. It energized them. And so he sees that list as partly responsible for his victory. So that's the first way he saw the court.
There's no wrong about that if you look at
Not wrong about that. But now he sees the real practical effects of the court. And he has learned that this week, and particularly over the travel ban, because you had liberal courts stymieing the travel ban, and this week it was upheld by the Supreme Court. So Trump now knows both the political force of this decision and the practical agenda force of this decision.
Charlie, to listen to Leonard Leo, who's advising President Trump on his next picks, and also advised on Neil Gorsuch, there's really
wrote the list.
And wrote the list. That's right.
Yeah.
There's really nothing Democrats can do other than trip up a potential candidate.
No, and I think that by any schedule, there ought to be someone confirmed by November. So we're looking at something that's going to probably happen before the election. What will be interesting to see is what will those senators from those states that obviously Trump has targeted, senators from states that overwhelmingly voted for Trump, is it going to make it very difficult for them to vote against a nominee by Trump? This is the sweetest of sweet spots for Trump. This is the thing that unites the establishment with the MAGA folks. And the greatest never Trumper has to admit that Neil Gorsuch was a huge success, and that the list that he picked from was a huge success, as Jonathan pointed out, and that if he will stick to this again because it's worked very well for him, and it's in all likelihood going to be another huge success.
So he's talking about the John Testers and the Heidi Heitkamps and the Claire McCaskells and the Joe Donnellys. They're going to be answering a ton of questions now in these races about how potentially they're going to vote. These are all the Democrats defending in red states, essentially, Trump states.
I predict minimum 2 of them vote for the nominee from that list.
Whoever it is.
Absolutely. Minimum 2. Maybe more. But the idea of Senator Gillibrand and other liberal senators, prospective 2020 candidates, saying, oh, we're not going to allow hearings. They don't run the Senate. No one cares if they show up at the hearing. Trying to grind the Senate to a halt to try to stop this is... they gave up the filibuster on Neil Gorsuch. They never should have. It was a huge mistake. They're just going to add insult to injury for themselves. It really is... it's going to be a mistake to pressure those senators, those Democrats you just named, who are up in cycle, by trying to shut the Senate down and stop this. It's not stoppable, and they need to take their toys and go home.
Here's the president and the leaders of the Senate.
We will begin our search for a new justice of the United States Supreme Court that will begin immediately.
The Senate stands ready to fulfill its constitutional role by offering advice and consent on President Trump's nominee to fill this vacancy. We will vote to confirm Justice Kennedy's successor this fall.
Our Republican colleagues in the Senate should follow the rule they set in 2016, not to consider a Supreme Court justice in an election year.
Well, that wasn't the rule. It was a presidential election year, and you know, you go back to President Obama, who had a vacancy filled in August before a midterm election. There are obviously Democrats who will make the case that they should hold on until after the election, but they really don't have the backing.
People in this environment will use whatever tool they can to advance their agenda. There are no rules, there are no standards of principle anymore. It's just whatever you can do to eke out an advantage. So again, you said it best first. Their only tool is to try and prevent him getting the votes to get through. That's it. And the whole ball game of those 10 red state senators.
Next up, the politics of this, plus that stunning defeat for a House Democratic leader in New York.
Our campaign was focused on just a laser-focused message of economic, social, and racial dignity for working-class Americans. I felt like our party could be better, our message could be better, and that we could be better as a country.
Our party is a big tent. Our districts are very different one from the other. They made a choice in one district. So let's not get yourself carried away as an expert on demographics and the rest of that.
The House Minority Leader kind of answering a lot of reporters' questions about what this means for the Democratic Party. This was a huge upset. Joe Crowley, a senior member of the leadership, he was in position to possibly become Speaker, definitely move up the chain of leadership in the Democratic House, and just gets annihilated in a primary against a self-proclaimed Democratic Socialist, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and there you see the numbers. You look at the RCP average of the generic ballot for heading into 18, and there you see where it stands now. You wonder how many different factors are going to factor into that, but one is what's happening in the Democratic Party. Jonathan.
Well, it's, again, very clear. All the energy is with you look at the slate of 2020 candidates who are out there. They're all saying universal health care, effectively free college. And now the new issue, which this successful candidate ran on, is abolishing Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, which I now expect to see more and more candidates come out on that, and maybe even sitting incumbents. So you are seeing, you know, the party is moving further to the left. That's a long-term trend, but the energy is there. And the idea that there could be a sort of Clintonian centrist emergence in this Democratic Party seems very far-fetched at the moment.
Maybe.
It's everything Jonathan said is right. It's clear that the Democratic Party is moving towards a free lunch socialism and embracing a way too liberal immigration policy that doesn't represent where the majority of the country is at. That's for sure, and I think they'll do so at their peril. But it's also true that Alexandria and Joe brought in a total of fewer than 28,000 votes last night in a 700,000-person district. That is beyond pitiful. Joe Crowley alone knows 20,000 people. That he got wiped out by 15 points. Yes, she energized new voters. Yes, this leftist insurgency is a real thing for the Democrats to deal with. But Joe Crowley was focused on his Washington national leadership ambitions, just as Eric Cantor was in Virginia 7 a few years ago. He did not tend to his constituency. He didn't show up at a debate and sent a surrogate. It is absolute political malpractice what he did. The fact that he could not turn out those votes, and she won with 27,000. Great for her. It is a landslide. But actually, this is a picture of everything that people hate about Washington. He couldn't serve his voters.
Yeah. Well, you know what? It reminds you a little bit of Eric Cantor and the fallout, and Nancy Pelosi talked about that back then when the House Majority Leader fell in a primary. And she said it was a bigger picture. And it meant a lot more about the party overall. it's very narrow in this instance.
And it was funny to hear her talking about the party being a big tent. It's a big tent. It has like one side on the West Coast and one side on the East Coast, and then a giant hole in the middle. And it's only going to get bigger with more candidates like this. We've known a reckoning like this was going to be coming for the Democratic Party for some time, just as it came for Republicans in the last half decade. The question always was, how bad would it be? And I think what we've seen from this is it's going to be much worse. And the reason is because, sure, Republicans wound up with some pretty unpolished candidates, but you're still dealing with these principled constitutionalists. Here, you're dealing with full-blown communists, and you don't want that in your party.
Democratic socialists, but yeah, I get your point.
What is the difference?
Where's the line?
Yeah, exactly.
I got you. She makes the case, but there is a long list of things that she thinks the government should pay for. Really quickly, back to the Supreme Court. The exit polls from the 2016 election. White evangelicals, white born-again Christians, 80-16. This is post-Access Hollywood, obviously, tape. In deciding your vote, what about the Supreme Court? Most important factor, 70% to 28. Well, is this going to energize, even though it might be done before the midterms, is this going to energize the Republicans or the Democrats?
There's also Pew polling which shows an 8-point gap in, if you ask voters which issues are very important to you. The Supreme Court, Trump voters 70%, Hillary Clinton voters 62%. So if you're looking at which side it's going to energize, it is, history shows anyway, it does slightly energize the Republican side more. But, you're going to see both sides gin up their bases and say, this is life or death. Vote for one and you'll get X, Y, and Z. Vote for the other and you'll lose abortion rights. It's going to be very, very polarized.
And a lot of money. I got to go, but go ahead.
This is vital for conservatives because conservatives care about principled, limited judiciary. And this, even if it happens after confirmation, it reminds them that there's a reason that they vote for Republicans. And that's a good thing before or after the confirmation.
No question.
When we come back, Justice Kennedy off the bench.